The dust swirled in lazy spirals across the station platform as Silas Hawkins counted the single-dollar coin into the station master's weathered palm. At 53, Silas had seen enough of life to know when opportunity knocked, even if that opportunity came in the form of a dilapidated train car that hadn't moved from its siding in 15 years. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Redemption Springs, a town that had boomed with the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad and busted nearly as quickly when the silver mines ran dry. What remained was a collection of stubborn souls and buildings weathered by the harsh Colorado elements. "She's all yours, Mr. Hawkins," said Harold Jenkins, the station master, pocketing the coin with a nervous glance toward the rusted Pullman car. "Though I still say you'd be better off with that plot of land outside town. Train car ain't good for nothing but scrap." His fingers trembled slightly as he handed over a folded piece of paper, the bill of sale. Silas noted the man's discomfort with quiet interest. He'd noticed that same unease in others when he'd mentioned his plans to purchase the abandoned car. 20 years as a cavalry scout and another decade as a bounty hunter had taught him to recognize when folks weren't telling the whole truth. "I appreciate your concern," Silas replied, tucking the paper into his vest pocket. His voice carried the gravelly quality of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping under stars and too many days riding through dust. "But I've been looking to settle down, and this suits me just fine." He ran a calloused hand along the peeling paint of the car's exterior. Once a handsome burgundy, now faded to the color of dried blood. The gold lettering that had once proudly displayed Western Pacific was barely visible beneath years of neglect. To most, it might seem worthless, but Silas saw potential. A home that wouldn't require him to put down roots too deep, yet solid enough to keep the elements at bay. Harold shifted his weight, eyes darting between Silas and the train car. "Well, it's yours now. Just remember, that back compartment door's been sealed up for a reason. Previous owner had it welded shut before he left town." He touched the brim of his hat nervously. "Some things are best left alone, Mr. Hawkins." With those cryptic words, Harold turned and hurried back toward the station house, his normally measured gait quickened to something close to a retreat. Silas watched him go, curiosity piqued. He'd heard rumors about the car since arriving in Redemption Springs 3 weeks ago, whispers that ceased whenever he drew near. Sideways glances from the townsfolk. The wind picked up, carrying the distant sound of piano music from the Rusty Spur Saloon 2 streets over. Silas climbed the metal steps into his new home, boots ringing against the iron. The interior was dusty but surprisingly intact. Plush velvet seats, once the height of railroad luxury, lined both sides. A small pot-bellied stove sat cold at one end, while ornate oil lamps hung at regular intervals from the ceiling. The craftsmanship was evident despite years of neglect. Carved wooden panels, brass fixtures tarnished but unbroken. It would take work to make it livable, but Silas had endured far worse conditions on the trail. He moved through the car methodically, assessing what could be salvaged and what would need replacing. His footsteps echoed in the empty space as daylight began to fade. At the far end, just as Harold had mentioned, stood a door, different from the others. This one was made of solid iron with a small window at eye level, now covered with a metal plate. Around its edges, he could see the telltale marks of welding sealing it shut. Whoever had done the work had been thorough, but not particularly skilled. With the right tools, Silas knew he could open it. The question was whether he should. His fingers traced the rough welds as memories stirred of locked doors in his past, prison cells in Santa Fe where he'd delivered bounties, hidden compartments in stagecoaches concealing Wells Fargo shipments, an abandoned mine shaft outside Tombstone where he'd tracked the Calloway gang to their demise. Every sealed door had its story, its purpose, and everyone he'd ever encountered had eventually been opened, for better or worse. This one would be no different, he decided, but first, he needed to understand why the town seemed so determined to keep it shut. Knowledge before action. That philosophy had kept him alive when many of his contemporaries had long since been planted beneath crude wooden crosses. As darkness fell, Silas lit one of the old oil lamps, pleasantly surprised to find it still functional. The warm glow cast dancing shadows across the interior, giving life to the abandoned space. Outside, he heard footsteps on the platform and turned to see Sheriff Thomas Miller standing at the entrance, hat in hand. At around 40, the lawman carried himself with the cautious dignity of someone who'd taken the badge, after experiencing life on both sides of the law. His salt-and-pepper beard was neatly trimmed, and a star-shaped scar on his left cheek told stories he rarely shared. Silas had shared a few whiskies with him since arriving in town, and found him to be straight-talking, if somewhat reserved. "Evening, Hawkins," the sheriff said, declining to step inside without invitation. "Heard from Jenkins you went through with buying this old heap." His eyes scanned the interior, lingering a moment too long on the sealed door at the far end. Silas gestured for him to enter, and the sheriff reluctantly mounted the steps, ducking his head beneath the low doorframe. "Figured I should pay a neighborly visit, see if you're settling in all right." The words were friendly enough, but his posture remained tense, like a man preparing himself for unpleasant business. "Just getting acquainted with my new property," Silas replied, watching the sheriff's reactions carefully. "Seems Harold was mighty anxious to be rid of it, despite the bargain price." He paused, then decided to address the matter directly. "He mentioned something about that back door being sealed for good reason. Thought perhaps the town's sheriff might shed some light on what's got everyone so spooked." Miller's jaw tightened visibly, and he removed his hat, running fingers through his thinning hair, a gesture Silas recognized as a stalling tactic. Whatever lay beyond that welded door, it clearly made the lawman uncomfortable. "This car has history, Hawkins," Miller finally said, replacing his hat with deliberate care. "Was part of a private train belonging to Wesley Thornton, railroad baron who helped build this town back in '76. Used it as his personal office and sleeping quarters when he visited his investments out this way." The sheriff moved toward one of the windows, looking out at the darkening town. "Last time Thornton came through was '82. There was trouble, bad trouble. By the time it was over, 4 men were dead, including Thornton himself. The town council decided some things are best forgotten. That door you're so curious about, it leads to Thornton's private compartment, where they found his body." Silas absorbed this information silently, noting what Miller had said and what he hadn't. "Found his body, how exactly?" he pressed, moving to stand beside the sheriff. Outside, the last light of day had faded, leaving the platform in darkness broken only by the distant glow of the town's windows. Miller turned to face him, something like resignation in his eyes. "Shot through the heart at close range, along with his bodyguard. 2 of our townsfolk were also killed that night, brothers who worked for Thornton. Official record says it was robbery gone wrong." Miller's tone made it clear he didn't believe the official version. "What matters is that the town council made a decision. Seal that compartment and leave the past buried. Folks around here respect that decision, Hawkins. I suggest you do the same." His hand unconsciously drifted toward the holstered Colt at his hip, not a threat, but a reminder of his authority. Silas nodded slowly, offering nothing that might be construed as a promise. "Appreciate the history lesson. Sheriff, I'll keep it in mind." A non-committal response that seemed to satisfy Miller, though suspicion lingered in the lawman's eyes. They exchanged a few more pleasantries before the sheriff departed, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts and his newly acquired mystery. As the sound of Miller's boots faded into the night, Silas examined the welded door once more. 4 men dead, a hastily sealed compartment, and a town full of people still nervous about it decades later. His instincts told him there was much more to the story than a simple robbery gone wrong. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of autumn day that hinted at winter's approach without surrendering to it completely. Silas had spent the night on one of the velvet benches, his saddlebags as a pillow, and his old cavalry coat as a blanket. He'd slept lightly, waking at every creak and groan of the old train car as it settled in the cool night air. Now, with sunlight streaming through the dusty windows, he set about making the place more habitable. His first stop was Harrigan's general store for supplies, a broom, cleaning materials, provisions and tools. The storekeeper, a rail-thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, regarded him with the same wary curiosity he'd encountered from others. "Heard you bought old Thornton's car," Franklin Harrigan remarked as he wrapped a new tin coffee pot in brown paper. "Bold choice for a newcomer." His tone suggested foolish might be a more accurate description than bold. Silas merely smiled and paid for his purchases, adding a box of cartridges for his Remington revolver. As he gathered his supplies, he noticed a woman watching him from the back of the store, middle-aged with silver streaking her dark hair, dressed plainly, but with a dignified bearing that set her apart. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, disappearing through a curtained doorway. Returning to the train car, Silas spent the morning sweeping decades of dust from the floors and washing the windows until daylight poured in unobstructed. The car was approximately 60 feet long, divided into what had once been a common area and several smaller compartments. With the sealed door, he could access about 2/3 of the total space, more than enough for his modest needs. Around midday, as he was repairing one of the benches, he heard footsteps on the platform. Looking up, he was surprised to see the woman from the general store standing in the doorway, a covered basket in her hands. "Mr. Hawkins," she said by way of greeting. "I'm Margaret Harrigan. Thought you might appreciate some lunch, seeing as you're hard at work." Her voice carried the refined tones of Eastern education. At odds with the frontier setting, Silas wiped his hands on a rag and invited her in with a gesture. She hesitated only briefly before entering, her eyes making the same inevitable journey toward the sealed door that everyone seemed to. "My husband mentioned you'd purchased this car. It's been sitting empty for so long. Most of us had forgotten it was even for sale. Seems to make folks uncomfortable," Silas observed, accepting the basket with a nod of thanks. Inside he found fresh bread, cold chicken, and a jar of preserves. "You didn't come all this way just to feed a stranger, Mrs. Harrigan." It wasn't a question. She smiled thinly, removing her gloves and taking a seat on one of the newly cleaned benches without waiting for an invitation. A woman accustomed to a certain social standing then. "No, Mr. Hawkins, I didn't." She looked directly at him now, her gaze unflinching. "I came to tell you what the sheriff and the others won't. My family has been in Redemption Springs since before the railroad. I was 16 when Wesley Thornton was killed in that compartment." She nodded toward the sealed door. "What happened that night shaped this town in ways that still echo today. The official story that it was a robbery is a convenient fiction. The truth is far more complicated, and there are people here who would prefer it remain buried." Silas set down the basket and leaned against the opposite wall, giving her his full attention. "I'm listening," he said simply. Something in his calm demeanor seemed to reassure her. She took a deep breath, glancing toward the open door to ensure they were truly alone. "Wesley Thornton wasn't just any railroad man," she began, her voice lowered despite the privacy. "He ruled this territory like a king. The town council, the mining operations, even the sheriff at that time, all answered to him. When the silver began to run out, he started squeezing harder. Foreclosures, strong-arm tactics, even arranged accidents for those who opposed him too openly." Her hands twisted in her lap, knuckles whitening. "My father was the town doctor. He treated the victims of Thornton's enforcers, kept records of the injuries. Evidence, he called it, though there was no court around here that would hear it." Margaret paused, collecting herself. That night, February 17, 1882, Thornton arrived unexpectedly, called a meeting in his private car with several town leaders, including my father. By morning, Thornton was dead, along with his bodyguard and the Blackwood brothers who worked for him. Her eyes drifted to the sealed door again. "They say it was robbery, but nothing was taken. They say it was outsiders, but no strangers were seen coming or going. What I know is that my father never came home that night, and 3 days later, they found his body in Crystal Creek, 10 miles outside town. Accident, they called it." Silas absorbed this information silently, his mind working through the implications. "And the other town leaders?" he finally asked. Margaret's bitter smile told him much before she even spoke. "Suddenly prosperous. Harold Jenkins, just a junior clerk at the station then, became station master within a month. Thomas Miller, who'd been little more than a deputy with a drinking problem, was appointed sheriff. Franklin's father took over the general store from its previous owner, who conveniently decided to move east." She stood, straightening her skirts with practiced precision. "The town council sealed that compartment and declared the matter closed. Most people were happy enough to go along with it. Thornton wasn't mourned, and times got better once he was gone. But some of us haven't forgotten." She moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face him. "Whatever you find behind that door, Mr. Hawkins, it will change things. For better or worse, remains to be seen." With that cryptic warning, she departed, leaving Silas with more questions than answers and a growing determination to uncover the truth. He ate the lunch she'd provided while considering his next steps. By mid-afternoon, he'd made his decision. He would open the sealed compartment, but not before gathering more information. In his experience, walking blindly into any situation was a good way to end up dead. Over the next 3 days, Silas established himself in Redemption Springs with calculated precision. He took his meals at the Rusty Spur, listening more than talking, absorbing the town's rhythms and relationships. He paid for drinks, lost modestly at poker, and presented himself as a world-weary drifter looking to retire somewhere quiet. Most importantly, he observed who associated with whom, which names caused conversations to halt, and how power flowed through the small community. What emerged confirmed Margaret Harrigan's account and added new dimensions to the mystery of Wesley Thornton's death. On the fourth day, as a light snow began to fall, marking the season's first real winter weather, Silas returned to his train car with supplies carefully selected for the task ahead. A cold chisel, a heavy hammer, and a pry bar purchased from the blacksmith under the pretense of needing to fix the stove. He waited until after midnight when the town had gone quiet, save for the distant piano from the saloon. Working methodically and as silently as possible, he began to chip away at the welds securing the iron door. The work was slow and painstaking, each strike of the hammer against the chisel threatening to echo in the night. After nearly 2 hours of careful labor, the last weld gave way with a muted crack. Silas paused, listening for any sign that the sound had attracted attention. Hearing nothing, he set down his tools and examined the door. The hinges were stiff with disuse, but otherwise intact. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the edge of the door and pulled. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the door swung outward, revealing darkness beyond. The smell that emerged was not the expected mustiness of long sealed spaces, but something sharper, more chemical, like the preservatives undertakers used. Silas raised his lantern, stepping cautiously into what had once been Wesley Thornton's private compartment. The space was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps 15 feet long, configured as a combined office and sleeping quarters. A desk bolted to the floor dominated one end, while a narrow bed occupied the other. What caught his attention immediately, however, was the wall opposite the desk. Floor to ceiling, it was covered with papers, maps, letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, all interconnected with red string, like some mad spider's web of information. Despite nearly 40 years of isolation, the papers remained largely intact, protected from the elements in the sealed compartment. Moving closer, he examined the collection. Maps of Redemption Springs and the surrounding territory, marked with locations of mines, water sources, and property boundaries. Photographs of prominent citizens, including younger versions of people he now recognized, Jenkins, Miller, and others who made up the town's leadership. Newspaper clippings about silver discoveries, railroad expansion, and land acquisitions. In the center of it all was a document that appeared to be a contract of some kind, with Wesley Thornton's flamboyant signature at the bottom. But what truly chilled Silas's blood were the dark stains splashed across the papers, the unmistakable brown of long-dried blood. He turned his attention to the desk, finding ledgers and correspondence books nearly arranged in the drawers. Thornton had been a methodical man, it seemed, documenting his business dealings with meticulous precision. One book in particular stood out, leather-bound with the word confidential embossed on the cover. Inside, Silas found detailed records of payments, blackmail, and threats, involving nearly every prominent citizen in Redemption Springs. Thornton hadn't just been a businessman, he'd been running a sophisticated extortion operation, leveraging secrets and vulnerabilities to control the town and its resources. The last entry in the journal was dated February 17, 1882, the day of Thornton's death. It contained just a few lines. Meeting tonight with the conspirators. Jenkins confirms document delivered from Denver. Once signed, consolidation will proceed as planned. Miller remains reluctant but controllable. The doctor is becoming problematic. Remedy to be applied after conclusion of business. The handwriting was steady, confident, the words of a man who had no idea he was recording his final thoughts. As Silas absorbed the implications, a floorboard creaked behind him. He whirled, hand dropping to his revolver, to find Sheriff Miller standing in the doorway, his own weapon already drawn. "Should have listened when I told you to leave that door sealed, Hawkins," the sheriff said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his stance. Behind him, Harold Jenkins peered nervously into the compartment, a shotgun clutched in trembling hands. "Now you've gone and complicated matters." Silas kept his hand near his weapon but didn't draw. "Seems to me things were already complicated, Sheriff, just buried under 40 years of lies." He nodded toward the blood-stained wall of documents. "Thornton was blackmailing half the town, including you. planning something big the night he died, something that required signatures and remedies for those who stood in his way. He watched Miller's reaction